Okay, let's unpack this. We are about to plunge into a fascinating chapter that fundamentally challenges how we understand reality, specifically by questioning the hierarchy of our senses.
That's absolutely right. For centuries, when people, especially philosophers interested in consciousness and cognition, talked about perception, the conversation defaulted instantly to vision.
Right. The eye.
The eye has historically been treated as the gold standard, the primary way we map and understand the world around us.
And it's easy to see why. I mean, vision is immediate. It gives us huge fields of information simultaneously, and it allows us to operate at a distance.
Of course.
But the core thesis of this deep dive is that this pervasive visual bias is a major philosophical blind spot. It often relies on what critics call a photographic model of vision.
Right, the idea that perception is just a passive receipt of information like snapping an instantaneous picture.
Exactly.
And the chapter we're diving into today argues that the sense we usually sideline touch might actually be the most fundamental and distinctive way we engage with the world.
Especially within the context of 4E cognition.
Yes, this is particularly crucial when we view cognition through that lens. The idea that the mind is embodied, embedded, enactive, and extended.
So we're not just asking if touch is important. We're asking if touch is maybe the essential starting point for understanding how the body shapes experience. We need to determine if touch is special, and if so, how its deep, intimate relationship with bodily movement and action sets it apart from all the rest.
To set the stage, the chapter introduces philosopher Alva Noë and his compelling claim that the passive photographic model is fundamentally mistaken, even for vision.
So even our best sense isn't what we think it is.
Not really. He argues that if we want a better model for perception in general, touch offers a far better template.
What's the model he uses to demonstrate this? It's incredibly visceral and immediate.
It is. Noé asks you to consider the blind person using a cane to perceive a cluttered space. This isn't a passive process. The cane becomes an extension of the person's hand, and perception of the environment, the gravel, the curb, the obstacles, isn't an instantaneous snapshot.
It's an active exploratory act of skillful probing.
Exactly. The perception unfolds through time and requires continuous physical movement to make the surrounding world available to the individual.
So perception isn't something that happens to us, it's something we do.
Right.
And this leads us directly to the foundational concept of enactive cognition, which structures this entire source material. Sensorimotor contingencies, or SMCs.
Yes.
This is a technical phrase, so let's be sure we unpack it clearly.
Okay, so SMC is the idea that all perception relies on action. It's the tacit, non-conceptual knowledge, a practical understanding of how our motor activities affect the patterns of sensory stimulation we receive.
Let's use a simple analogy. If you are holding a brightly colored object and you turn your head, the pattern of light hitting your retina changes in a highly predictable way. The light pattern is contingent on your head movement.
Exactly. Or, for touch, if you move your hand quickly across a rough surface, the pattern of vibration and pressure changes predictably.
And if you stop moving,
The pattern changes predictably again, potentially stabilizing into a static pressure point. That learned predictability, that dependency of sensation on action, that is the contingency.
and Noe's big claim is that this means all perception is fundamentally touch-like.
That's the claim.
That's a revolutionary thought. It means vision isn't passive viewing, it's active visual scanning, driven by SMCs. Hearing isn't just passive reception of sound waves.
You're actively turning your head to localize a sound source, changing the input patterns predictably. The claim is that perception involves knowing how to intentionally manipulate one's sensory stream.
And that's the starting point for our deeper investigation. If all senses rely on SMCs, the question becomes, is touch distinct because it relies on more or maybe different kinds of bodily activity?
Is the difference qualitative or just quantitative?
That sets our mission statement for this deep dive. We are going to follow the chapter's argument precisely. First, we must overcome the immediate hurdle of even defining touch, because that proves surprisingly difficult.
It really does.
Then, we will intensely scrutinize the link between touch and movement, testing claims that touch is more inactive.
And finally, we will test several classic philosophical arguments for touch's unique primacy. The idea that it is the ultimate test of reality, to see if its true strength lies in uniqueness or simply in its astonishing diversity.
Let's jump into that initial complication, because it's a huge methodological problem for anyone studying this. Trying to generalize about tactual perception is immediately problematic.
It is.
If we can't define what exactly counts as touch and what doesn't, How can we assert its primacy?
This is where we need to introduce the traditional philosophical criteria used to individuate or, logically separate one sense from another. Drawing on philosopher H.P. Grice from 1966, the philosophical community typically uses 4 criteria to classify a sense modality.
Lay out those 4 criteria for us.
First, what is perceived content? What kind of external properties are made available? Is it color, shape, pitch?
Okay.
Second, the distinctive introspectable quality. This is the subjective what it is likeness of the experience. What makes red feel different from C sharp?
The raw feeling.
Then third, the kinds of physical stimuli detected. Is it light waves, pressure waves, chemical compounds? And fourth, the sense organs involved.
These sound incredibly neat and orderly. The problem, as the chapter shows, is that the moment you apply these clear, bounded criteria to touch, the whole framework just collapses.
It really does.
Let's start with the physical problems, the sense organ and the stimulus.
The organ problem is immediate and severe. Touch has no clearly bounded, localized organ like the eye or the ear. It utilizes exterior and interior surfaces, hair, many different types of sensory receptors, and is totally dispersed across the body.
And critically, it cannot operate in isolation from our awareness of the body itself.
Absolutely. Tactual perception must also include proprioception, our sense of bodily position, and kinesthesia, our sense of movement.
Right.
If you lack those internal senses, you lose the ability to actively perceive complex properties, like the shape or size of an object, simply by moving your hand over it. It's not just the surface receiver. It's the entire body, surfaces, and internal awareness functioning as one integrated system.
So the boundary of the organ is the boundary of the living body. That already violates the neat, localized idea of a sense organ.
Completely.
Now, what about this stimulus problem?
Well, touch is not receptive to a single stimulus type. If you try to say it's simply a pressure sense, you immediately exclude detection of vibration. And vibration, as pioneering psychologist David Katz noted way back in 1925, isn't just pressure or a change in pressure. It's a temporally extended, structured pattern of pressure changes, which requires time to unfold and be perceived.
That distinction is important. If I press my finger on a table, that's static pressure. If a mosquito lands on my arm, that's transient pressure. But vibration, like feeling a phone buzz in your pocket, is a highly structured, dynamic input. To put all 3 under one stimulus type feels like cheating the criteria.
And that's before we even include hot and cold. Tactual perception is inseparable from the perception of temperature, meaning touch relies on at least 2 distinct forms of energy mechanical force and thermal energy.
Katz observed that temperature contributes to the recognition of almost every material.
Exactly.
This is where the physics and the psychology truly intertwine in a surprising way. We have the counterintuitive research that cold surfaces generally feel smoother than warmer ones. Why is that?
Well, the underlying mechanism suggests that temperature affects the blood flow and the compliance of the skin, which changes how the skin interacts with the microscopic features of a surface.
So our judgment of a texture is literally dependent on a thermal sensation.
Yes. You can't cleanly isolate them in experience, even though they rely on different energy inputs.
That single fact, that temperature informs texture, is one of those nuggets of knowledge that immediately destroys the idea of touch as a simple unitary sense.
And the neurobiology supports the collapse. Research shows some sensory neurons are multifunctional, simultaneously detecting heat, mechanical stimuli, and chemical irritants. The neural wiring itself is jumbled together.
You can't just rule out hot-cold perception as a separate sense based on the old criteria.
Right. Because the loss of temperature sensitivity doesn't mean a total loss of touch, just as color blindness doesn't mean total loss of vision, but it's all mixed up in the input layer.
Okay, let's move past the physical inputs and receptors to the output. What is actually perceived, the content of the quail? If we try to define touch as strictly perceiving physical contact, we run into problems with distance touch. What are the best examples of this phenomenon?
The classic example is the blind person using the cane. The content of the experience isn't the pressure on the hand from the handle. The salient content is the gravel under the tip or the object being investigated 20 feet away.
Right.
The perception travels through the medium, but the content is distant.
Or using kitchen tongs to grab something hot. The entire point is to feel the weight and location of the object without feeling its heat directly on your skin.
Yes, you are perceiving the object's properties through the tool.
We can even talk about passive distance touch, like sitting on a subway. You are perceiving the quality of the train track, the smoothness or bumpiness of the ride via pressure and vibration transmitted through the seat cushion and the train itself.
Even though you are miles away from the tracks, this perception is clearly tactual, yet it violates the strict criterion of immediate skin contact.
And then there's the fascinating case of the perception of absence. How can a contact sense reveal something that isn't there?
If touch were strictly a contact sense, it would only signal input. But Katz noted that when you run a hand across a stiff brush, you perceive not only the bristles but the empty space, the tactual ground between the bristles.
The pattern of contact and non-contact reveals the void, not just the solid matter. Or, even more commonly, the absence of a familiar pressure. Feeling the emptiness on your finger after taking off a wedding ring, or running your hand along a flat wall and registering the space where a painting used to hang.
The negative space becomes content. This makes the content and Quell criteria impossible to pin down.
The contents are wildly diverse. Objects, textures, dynamic forces, static shapes, contact, absence, temperature.
And affective qualities like pleasantness or pain. When you stroke a piece of velvet, what are you perceiving? Is it the fibers? Is it the texture, the smoothness?
It all blurs and intermingles.
And the sheer richness of this diversity is captured powerfully by Helen Keller's description of her refined, tactual sense. Her experience demonstrates that touch isn't just about localized bumps and stops. It's about a full, holistic, detailed environment.
She spoke of the thousand soft voices of the earth finding their way to her, the tiny rustle in the grass, the silky swish of leaves, the hum of bees.
She described feeling the slender, rippling vibration of water running over pebbles. But most tellingly, she described the thrilling energy of the all-encasing air that played upon her face.
Wow.
This highlights that her tactual world was not one of simple mechanical pressure. It was a sensory symphony relying on temperature gradients, subtle vibrations, air pressure changes, and proprioceptive inputs, all fused into a coherent, highly informative perceptual field.
It just defies any singular Quell or content definition.
Absolutely.
Given this massive heterogeneity, we must circle back to our core concept, sensor-motor contingencies. If SMCs are the structure of the rules governing sensory changes produced by motor actions, the chapter argues that even appealing to SMC fails to individuate touch. Why?
Because touch employs the whole body and its huge variety of motor capacities. Think about the variety of actions. Running a fingertip laterally across a surface.
That's fine motor control for texture.
Enclosing an object with the entire hand.
Gross motor control for shape.
Or using your feet and legs to test the rigidity of the ground beneath you.
Which is locomotor control for stability.
Right. The SMC patterns involved in those three tasks, texture exploration, shape enclosure, and ground stability testing, are fundamentally distinct from one another. They rely on different parts of the body, different types of movement, and different sensory inputs.
Vibration versus pressure versus kinesthesia.
So we have this huge collection of sensorimotor patterns that we are forced to group together as touch, simply because they don't fit into the other categories.
And yet those internal patterns of touch SMCs are often more distinct from each other than they are from, say, the ocular scanning patterns used in vision.
Precisely.
So if the entire project of individuating touch based on traditional criteria organ, stimulus, content, Quell fails, and even the unifying framework of SMCs shows massive internal variation.
We are forced to adopt a functional definition. Touch is simply everything that requires bodily movement and is not sight, hearing, smell, or taste.
That moves us into section 2, where we stop trying to define touch based on passive criteria and embrace its fundamental tie to action.
Yes, the conclusion from section 1 is that touch must be defined broadly to include the body's active role.
That means we must explicitly draw the distinction that the critique highlighted was missing in the earlier draft. We have to be clear. We are dealing with tactual haptic perception, not just tactile perception.
Exactly. Tactile refers strictly to perception mediated by skin receptors, the localized surface feeling. Tactual haptic includes proprioception, body position, and kinesthesia, body movement.
And the chapter states the strong claim
That the ability to perceive complex 3D properties like the shape or mass of an object relies almost entirely on active exploratory touch. It is a haptic necessity.
And the 4E approach challenges the old idea that haptic perception is just a matter of obtaining two separate pieces of information, the tactile input and the proprioceptive location, and then fusing them together after the fact.
It's far more intertwined than a fusion model. The moment we initiate action, sensation is regulated. We see this vividly demonstrated in the phenomenon of sensory attenuation, using the famous example of self-tickling.
Why is it that most people cannot tickle themselves, or the sensation is severely diminished? What is the underlying mechanism at play here?
When you initiate a self-movement, your brain predicts the sensory consequences of that movement.
Okay.
The initiation of the action sends signals that actively attenuate or weaken the incoming peripheral sensory signals before they are fully processed.
So the brain says, I already know what sensation is coming, so I'm going to dial down the volume on the input.
Precisely. It's not that information about the self-produced movement modifies an already given pattern of sensory activity. The movement itself regulates the incoming signals in a non-conscious, predictive way.
That is a crucial mechanism. It shows that action is not a precursor to perception. It is integral to the sensory processing itself.
Yes, it demonstrates a profound, non-conscious control loop where we are constantly modeling the sensory consequences of our own movements.
That completely changes our understanding of self-awareness. It means the distinction between self and world is being drawn at the level of sensory processing itself before the full percept even arrives.
And the research goes further to solidify this action-sensation confluence. Studies, like those by Saig and colleagues in 2012, showed that the same perceptual changes in the somatosensory cortex could be brought about either through changes in sensory stimulation or through bodily activity.
The two variables were shown to be, in principle, fully interchangeable.
Which demonstrates a tight motor-sensory confluence right at the core of haptic perception.
But let's play the devil's advocate, representing a skeptical listener. What about the objection of passive touch?
Yes.
If I'm simply lying still and a spider crawls on my neck, that's sophisticated, localized perception. I know where it is, how big it is, and I know I didn't cause it, but I'm not actively moving my body to explore it.
Right.
How does this passive experience fit into a model where perception is dependent on what the body is doing?
This is a crucial challenge, and the chapter addresses it head-on. Passive touch still relies on the ability to distinguish self-initiated movement from an external force acting upon the body.
Wait, if passive touch relies on movement awareness, doesn't that just sound like we're redefining movement to include non-movement or lack of self-movement?
Not exactly. It relies on the framework of movement potential. To perceive the spider crawling on your neck, you must simultaneously perceive that the sensory pattern is not the anticipated consequence of your own motor commands.
I see.
The experience is essentially, this sensation is happening and I am not causing it.
It relies on the integrity of the predictive motor system to reject the self-origination hypothesis. Without that framework, the sensation would be meaningless noise.
Precisely. If you lacked all ability to distinguish between movements you caused and those that happened to you, the experience would be indeterminate, neither active nor passive, just a chaos of changing inputs.
So both active haptic and passive tactile forms of touch rely fundamentally on a working sense of what, if anything, one is doing or intending to do. The structure of tactual perception seems overwhelmingly consistent with the sensorimotor contingency view. But the chapter does include a caveat about those widespread, diffuse immersion experiences.
Yes. What about feeling that I am hot? Or when you are sitting deeply in a soft leather armchair and the couch becomes a tactual background?
Or swimming underwater, where the water pressure is an all-over bodily context rather than a localized object of perception?
These are instances of diffuse tactual immersions. Well, it's unclear how these wide, all-over bodily experiences where bodily boundaries blur with the medium can be accounted for solely by localized, discrete sensorimotor couplings.
Right.
The pervasive feeling of the water or the couch might be better conceived of as the context or the medium within which the localized exploratory couplings operate. They are tactual, but perhaps not contingent on specific localized actions in the typical sense.
That nuance is important, as it prevents the theory from becoming too rigid. This leads us directly to the core debate of the section. Is touch more inactive than other senses, or is it just different in scale?
This is where Matthew Fulkerson offers a sophisticated defense of touch's distinctiveness, using the concept of exploratory feature binding.
Okay, what exactly is exploratory feature binding, and why does Fulkerson think it makes touch qualitatively unique?
Fulkerson argues that touch is the only sense that achieves perceptual coherence binding features like temperature, hardness, and texture into a single object by manipulating the environment in specific, structured, temporally extended exploratory procedures.
And he's drawing on the work of Letterman and Klatsky here.
Yes, who identified distinct procedures: lateral motion for texture, enclosure for shape, pressure for hardness.
So the argument is that while vision binds features like color and shape, it does so instantaneously from a single or small set of glances. Touch, by contrast, requires a sequence of specific, manipulative movements over time to construct the object's identity.
Exactly. He claims that only touch makes the construction of the object dependent on those physical manipulations. Therefore, touch is the most inactive sense.
Now, the chapter levels two powerful critiques against this idea, which we need to fully elaborate on. The first is a critique of feature-object ambiguity.
Right. The definitions just aren't tight enough to support the claim.
How so?
If we look at Fulkerson's framework, he defines objects broadly to include spatiotemporal objects, sounds, and smells. But this creates confusion. If I hear a passing motorbike, is the sound an object, or is the sound, its pitch and volume, a feature of the bike?
If I subtract the pitch, I still have the bike. The boundaries are slippery?
It gets even worse with texture. Fulkerson calls texture a feature of a tactual object, but as we discussed with the smoothness-temperature connection, texture is itself assembled out of other features like temperature, hardness, and slipperiness.
So if features can have features, then the concept of what constitutes a stable object versus a transient feature is ill-defined and arbitrary.
And consider smell. If I perceive a cheesy smell, that cheesiness is the quality of the smell. If I subtract the cheesiness, I no longer experience the smell at all. This suggests that the quality is inseparable from the object of smell.
Which is unlike the red color of a cup, which is separable from the cup itself.
So if the definitions are this elastic, we can't really use them to establish touch's unique process.
Which opens the door for the second critique. Exploratory binding is not unique to touch. The idea that only touch uses active manipulation to bind features is simply inaccurate.
Yes. If we accept that objects are things composed of sensory elements, then exploratory feature binding happens frequently in multisensory contexts. Think about the active process of eating.
Yes, the example of manipulating a piece of chocolate in your mouth. You are not passively receiving information.
Not at all. You actively move the chocolate with your tongue, jaw, and cheeks, binding taste, texture, temperature, and smell into one unified perceptual object. That is a complex, temporally extended, and manipulative exploratory procedure.
It is fully inactive and results in unified perception.
Or consider the visual and auditory realms. If you shake a wrapped present to hear its contents, or if you actively sniff a piece of fruit, moving it closer and farther from your nose, maybe rolling it between your fingers, you are performing an exploratory procedure to assign the smell as a feature of the visual object.
And the resulting percept is no less unified than the tactual objects.
The only way Fulkerson could defend the uniqueness is to argue that in the multisensory cases, the feature started off as separate percepts that were later associated, whereas touch provides the object and the feature simultaneously.
But the chapter counters that this separate then associate mechanism applies equally to complex tactual exploration.
Right.
Simple movements are often insufficient to unify complex tactual features. If you are trying to judge the shape, rigidity, and temperature of an object, you are employing several distinct exploratory procedures.
Enclosure, pressure, lateral motion.
Those separate procedures yield initially separate tactual percepts before being bound by a more complicated sequence.
Therefore, the overall conclusion on an action is clear. There is no qualitative difference in exploratory activity that separates touch. All perception is inactive.
Touch's superior appearance of enactment is only a quantitative difference.
Exactly.
It seems more inactive because it encompasses a far greater variety of exploratory strategies than the localized structures of other senses.
Exactly. The fact that the entire body serves as the organ of touch, including the immense dexterity and flexibility of the hands, facilitates a massive diversity of specialized procedures. Other senses, like the eye or the ear, rely on far more localized structures with narrower ranges of movement.
Touch has an unfair advantage in scale, but not in mechanism.
That's a great way to put it.
We've established that touch isn't qualitatively unique in how it operates, but perhaps it is unique in what it reveals about reality.
Yes.
With the failure of the enactivist claims to establish qualitative difference, we must shift our focus to Section 3.
Yes.
The older, more metaphysical arguments for why touch should be considered the primary or most fundamental sense.
These are powerful claims rooted in phenomenology and the metaphysics of the body. Let's start with Primacy Claim A, touch and force causation.
This argument, popularized by Hans Jonas in 1954, suggests that vision gains objectivity, the ability to map external space clearly, but it loses the crucial link to reality. What is that link?
Jonas claimed touch has primacy because it is the only sense where the perception of quality, The smoothness, the hardness, is normally blended with the immediate visceral experience of force. The pushback. When you push on something, you feel the resistance, the effort. This, Jonas argued, makes touch the true test of reality, the original encounter where we learn about causation and substance.
That sounds incredibly compelling. When we want to test if something is real, we reach out and touch it. It speaks directly to our common sense about physical existence.
It does.
What is the chapter's primary critique against this, especially regarding the exclusivity of force perception?
First, if vision is active and exploratory, if we are constantly anticipating tactual possibilities, the disanalogy between sight and touch holds less water than Jonas assumed in 1954.
Okay.
Second, force perception is simply not exclusive to touch.
How so? If I see a train hit a wall, I see a huge impact force, but I don't feel it through touch.
But the experience of force on your body is frequently multisensory. If somebody shoves you hard, the experience is not just localized pressure.
Right.
You hear the noise of the impact, you see a sudden chaotic change in the visual field as you lose your balance, and your proprioception signals a loss of bodily equilibrium.
The experience of being acted upon is a composite.
If the visual changes and the noise were absent, would the experience of being shoved still feel the same? Probably not. It is the composite nature of the experience that makes the causal force so real.
And furthermore, the argument that touch provides a simple, isolable perception of force or pressure is flawed.
Because it abstracts away the affective richness of real-world tactual experiences.
This is where the emotional component of touch comes in. Give us the thought experiment that reveals this abstraction.
Okay. Consider the difference between squeezing a large, warm piece of rubber and squeezing your naked spouse.
Okay.
In terms of pure pressure dynamics, the patterns of tactual stimulation, the mechanoreceptor signals, the temperature inputs, the forces exerted might be identical.
But the two perceptual experiences are drastically existentially different.
Precisely. The experience of squeezing the spouse includes affective tendencies, emotional attachments, and anticipations of reciprocity that are integral to the percept itself.
The pleasantness of a caress is perceived simultaneously with the touch. It is not a cognitive judgment made after the fact.
So to isolate the pure feeling of pressure and declare it the most fundamental test of reality is to prioritize an abstract, laboratory-isolated subset of touch over the vast majority of our richly contextualized, effectively charged tactual encounters.
The chapter argues that the content is far richer than simple pressure.
That's the key. Touch encompasses affection, pain, comfort, and causality. To prioritize only the latter simplifies the sensory modality to the point where the claim of primacy becomes indefensible.
Let's move to primacy claim B, touch as essential to animality. This is the argument put forward by O'Shaughnessy, who suggested that touch is essential to the animal condition as such.
Yes, because it overlaps with the sheer capacity for physical action and involves physical contact with the world.
This sounds intuitively powerful. But the chapter finds a serious conflation here. Can you break down the conceptual error O'Shaughnessy is making in simpler terms for us?
He fails to distinguish between three concepts. First, physical contact, the fact that two bodies occupy the same space.
Okay.
Second, a sense that utilizes physical contact, like touch. And third, a sense of physical contact, the resulting perception.
Why should we care about that distinction?
Because it is trivially true that being a physical entity means you come into physical contact with other things. A rock is in physical contact with the earth, but that doesn't mean the rock has a sense based on that contact.
So O'Shaughnessy conflates the metaphysical necessity of being a body with the perceptual necessity of sensing contact.
Exactly. The chapter uses the thought experiment of a hypothetical jellyfish. This jellyfish is a physical entity, so it's constantly in physical contact with water and sediment.
Right.
But its perception might be entirely internally located and sensitive only to magnetic fields, chemical gradients, or acidity levels, which it uses to navigate and find food.
It has a body, it acts, and it perceives, but its perceptual system is not based on sensing external contact pressure.
Exactly. The conclusion is that having a body and interacting with one's environment do not require the perception of external physical contact. The claim is either trivially true or fundamentally false.
Let's move to our final and perhaps most influential metaphysical claim. Primacy claim C touch constitutes the body.
This is a powerful phenomenological argument from figures like Husserl and Katz.
This argument is about the Leib, the lived body, as opposed to the Körper, the objective physical body.
Yes. Husserl argued that touch, and only touch, is indispensable to experiencing ourselves as embodied subjects. It is constituted originarily only in tactuality.
And the classic example they use to illustrate this is the reversible nature of self-contact. How does that demonstrate the constitution of the lived body?
When my left hand touches my right hand is initially perceived as an object, a lump of flesh with certain qualities.
Right.
But instantaneously, the roles are reversible. My left hand is also perceived as being touched, and the right hand becomes the perceiver. The point is that the distinction between perceiver and perceived is simultaneously present and interchangeable.
And this unique ambiguity is what establishes the bodily boundaries and the feeling of mindness.
It's the only sense where the sense organ can become its own object of perception, and vice versa. It's a dynamic, two-sided experience of being both subject and object.
But the chapter critiques this by returning to its central theme, the diversity of touch.
Wait.
Why prioritize this one specific achievement reversible roles in localized self-contact as being the most fundamental?
That is a great challenge. If I rub my palms together vigorously, the experience is often a unified, tactual percept of warmth and friction, rather than two separate, albeit interdependent, perceptions of each hand.
I'm focusing on the overall sensation, not the localized difference.
Exactly. These two experiences, localized reversible roles versus a unified non-localized percept, are contradictory achievements for the same sense. If touch is so diverse, how can we assert that one singular, localized type of self-contact is fundamental?
Furthermore, touch is also the sense that facilitates diffuse immersion, where the feeling of bodily boundaries blurs entirely.
Think about the feeling of complete comfort sitting on a perfectly contoured couch, or the non-localized feeling of cutaneous contact with the earth as we stand.
Which Gibson noted is a key way of registering the stable environment.
In these experiences, we are not attending to localized contacts or reversible roles. The body dissolves into the background context.
So if touch can constitute the body by establishing sharp, localized contact and difference,
and by providing a diffuse, non-localized sense of immersion,
then the perceptual encounter between body and world is too multifaceted to be grounded in one singular accomplishment.
all of these traditional priority claims fail because they take the form of a certain kind of touch, X is primary because of its unique feature Y, when one could just as easily argue that another form of touch, Z, is primary because of its unique feature W.
The heterogeneity of touch defeats any attempt to ascribe a singular, unique, qualitative achievement to it. So what does this all mean? We started by saying touch might be primary, but then we spent the last half hour dismantling every claim for its uniqueness, whether based on physical criteria, action, force, or bodily constitution.
Right.
If touch isn't uniquely special in any one way, why should we still consider it primary?
The final synthesis of the chapter is the most profound revelation. The most plausible case for the primacy of touch involves an appeal not to any particular characteristic, but to its diversity, ubiquity, and sheer indispensability.
That is a powerful and very practical conclusion. It moves the argument from metaphysics to survival.
If every sensory achievement encompassed by touch were suddenly absent, if we lost the capacity to feel pressure, heat, vibration, self-contact, proprioception, and kinesthesia, human life would be immediately unsustainable.
Wow.
We would not know where our limbs were, we could not grasp objects, and we would be completely unaware of extreme temperatures or painful contact. The same absolute claim of indispensability simply does not hold true for the other established senses, particularly vision.
So touch provides a multifaceted test of reality precisely because it accommodates so many different ways of encountering an entity as vibrating, hard, warm, smooth, or resistant.
All of which relate to each other and to the deliverances of the other senses in a cohesive way. It gives us a wide range of perceptual encounters to abstract from rather than a singular isolated experience of force.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The chapter notes that tactual possibilities permeate all experience, even non-tactual ones.
Yes.
This isn't just about what touch does, it's about how touch grounds and informs other senses.
This is the concept of anticipated tactual experience. Tactual possibilities are absolutely integral to the visual appreciation of proximity.
So when you look at a coffee mug on your desk,
You don't just see a set of colors and shapes, you see a cup that looks graspable, you see a surface that looks smooth to the touch.
the visual percept is already loaded with tactual possibility.
Precisely. If a visual entity lacked this tactual possibility, if it looked like a shimmering illusion that couldn't exert force or resistance, it would appear strangely distant, somehow not quite real or not quite there.
As Husserl and Merleau-Ponty suggest.
No, right. Touch is the mechanism that validates and grounds our visual and auditory experiences in physical reality.
So touch is primary because it encompasses such a massive scope, functioning both as its own complex set of senses and as the ultimate physical validator for all other senses.
It is not that some single form of touch holds a singularly intimate relationship with the world, but rather that its massive heterogeneity simply allows it to relate to reality in far more indispensable ways than any other modality.
It truly has an unfair advantage in scale and scope.
It is everything and everywhere, all at once.
Which leaves us with the truly provocative question the chapter raised at the very beginning, now amplified by the sheer scale of the evidence. Given its massive heterogeneity, incorporating pressure, heat, vibration, self-contact, proprioception, and distance perception, should what we call touch even be regarded as a single, unitary sense at all?
If we define a sense by its distinct organ or stimulus, touch fails immediately. If we define it by its function, touch performs so many contradictory functions, from localized contact to diffuse immersion, that its unity is highly questionable.
It truly challenges the very boundaries of perceptual science.
It does.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into perception, exploration, and the primacy of touch. We hope this exploration has proven that moving the cane out of the background and into the spotlight completely reshapes how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the world.